Hi, I'm Doug Kelley. I'm the Lincoln Professor of Relationship Ethics and Professor of Communication at Arizona State University. And I'm here today to talk to you about the play of ethics. I suppose the first question that you might have is, did you mean the ethics of play? And the answer to that is no. Actually, there is an ethics of play, and there's been some work done on the dark side of play, and we found some of that in our research, but that's not exactly where we're going today. So we're going to be talking about play as it's used to engage our full humanity, as it helps us move toward being more moral and more ethical with one another. So in that vein, I feel obligated as a social scientist to make full disclosure. If there's some bias built into my research, you should probably know that. And so I want you to take a look at this slide if it's possible. I have one tattoo on my body. It's down at the ankle. It happens to say play. And when I trail run and when I hike, it's there as a reminder to engage, to be present, to take risks. So now that we're all on the same page and we're being honest with each other, let's move on to talk about why play. Play is a characteristic of all mammals. It's used for learning and teaching. It's used for connection, stimulation, just for the pure joy of it. But anthropologist Ashley Montague has said, play has probably been the most important factor in the evolution of social behavior with vertebrates and possibly also in the mental and spiritual life of humankind. Why would he say this? What is it that's so critical about play? Play engages our minds in creative ways. It moves us out of the concrete now to an extent to imagine what might be. Albert Einstein tells us that the gift of fantasy has meant more to me than my talent for absorbing knowledge. Oftentimes when students come to the university, they think that our job as professors is to impart knowledge to them. But especially in today's world, you can do that on your own with the internet. What you need is ways to imagine the future, to reimagine yourself and think about the world in new and fresh ways. So researcher and scholar Olafsson from South Africa talks about the role of imagination in that post-apartheid time. And she says that imagination can play a role in rehumanizing the other through enabling and overcoming of indifference to the other's pains and plights. Right? Through imagination, I can get into your world. Right? Through imagination, I can have some idea of what it might be like to be you. I don't understand that fully, but you won't understand me fully either. And somewhere in the meeting of that understanding, we experience our full humanity together. So play brings empathy and allows us to become fully human. Broom, in talking about intercultural relationships, says this: to engage in the process of relational empathy, a certain degree of playfulness is necessary. Instead of seeking certainty, closure, and control in a conversation, one must be tentative and experimental, displaying a sense of open-endedness, allowing individuals in an intercultural encounter to move toward understandings that are provisional and open to change. There's this beautiful meeting between persons that happens when there's a sense of openness, right? A sense of learning, a sense of imagination and playfulness as I try to understand what it's like in your experience to come from a particular culture, or to be female or male, or in any way your different experience from mine in life, right? It becomes something that I can begin to tap into. And we come at it much like my training as a social scientist, with hypothesizing, asking questions, building theory from the ground up as I see things that are happening and I'm wondering why, and then testing those things. It's a beautiful process between people. Now this leads us to think about how do we engage with one another for each other's best interest, if you will. And so I've begun writing about advocacy and how play and imagination and creativity can be used to create spaces for us to advocate for one another. A definition that I've begun using a couple of years ago and is in a little book that I wrote last year called Just Relationships, Living Out Social Justice as Mentor, Family, Friend, and Lover, is this: creating a space where if something good can happen, it will. This is advocacy. This is the nature of interpersonal advocacy. Now, I learned this from, not from books really, but I learned it from my youngest son when he was about 18 years old. And he had dropped out of high school while I was teaching family communication here at Arizona State University. All right, so life is ironic at times. And we were in a rather intense conversation one day, and then he turned to me and he said, "Dad, you can't change me. I have to want to change." And it broke me because I realized he was right. But I was afraid. I wanted to control him. I thought I knew what was best for him in his life. And the reality was that I couldn't. So what his mom and I could do is create a space for him that was safe enough to come back into when he was ready. And then we would begin to co-create that space. And that's what happened. So what is this type of space then? It is a safe space that people can come back into. It's characterized by vulnerability and connection and voice. Voice is very much connected to the idea of who we are as persons, finding our voice, a place that's safe to fail, to try things. And this is what our son was doing, right? He was trying to find his way, find his own voice in life. So this idea of advocacy creates a space then that becomes co-created once we've joined together in it. So with our earlier discussion on play, let's talk for a minute about play and advocacy then. How does play intersect with this idea of creating a space that's safe and vulnerable and connecting? Well, play space is creative and spontaneous. It allows us to adapt to an ever-changing world, to our ever-changing relationships and relationship partners. When you play, you're fully present. I love to play ping pong. Like, you can't be thinking about anything else than when you're right there. But when I'm playing with another person, right, then I'm fully present with them. Once when I was playing catch with one of my kids in the backyard, I was trying to do too many things at once, and I was throwing the ball, and then I would pick weeds out while he was getting the ball back to throw back to me. And then I'd throw the ball, and he called me on it. Finally, like, "Dad, what are you doing?" And I realized I wasn't fully present with him. This wasn't really play. If you've seen the movie Field of Dreams, the end scene, there's very few words. It's just a son and his dad playing catch with one another, fully present. It drops inhibitions, right? It allows us, as we'll talk about later, to fully be ourselves. And then that process then allows us to connect with one another. So play becomes a meeting of our true selves in many ways. A few years ago, I was talking with a young woman, and she was in her mid-30s and a little frustrated that she wasn't in a more permanent romantic relationship at the time. And I asked her, I said, "What are you looking for with someone?" And she said to me, "I'm looking for someone that I can be silly with." Right? And what she was talking about was that I'm looking for someone where I can be my true self, where I can be vulnerable, where I'm not going to be judged, where I don't have to put on the full persona any longer. Listen to this quote by Brown. "Of all animal species, humans are the biggest players of all. We are built to play and built through play. When we play, we are engaged in the purest expression of our humanity, the truest expression of our individuality. Is it any wonder that often the times we feel most alive, that make up our best memories, are moments of play?" Well, we've conducted 2 studies related to this. Both are ongoing presently, but I'm going to share a little bit of our findings at this point. One is on intimacy and play, and I'm just going to give you a little bit on this because it really sets us up to talk about the second one that's about advocacy. So the intimacy and play study, part of it, we asked people for examples and stories about when play helped them be more intimate in a relationship or demonstrated intimacy that was there. And we found behavioral themes and emotional expression themes. The behavioral themes were things like humor and games that people played together and shared activities like going to ball games and going to museums or hiking. And affectionate touch. There was a beautiful story that all of us fell in love with of one woman who was in her 40s who would ride on a motorcycle with her partner and her arms around him. And when they would come up to a stoplight, it was still too loud for them to talk and they had helmets on. But she described him reaching back and just touching her calf and her reaching forward and just squeezing him on the forearm. And I was like, I need to buy a motorcycle, right? You know, I mean, it was a beautiful, beautiful moment. And then mock fighting, which we'll see won't show up for us so much in the next study. But here, the wrestling, the play fighting that so many people engage in, that I certainly did with my boys even. Intimacy and play and the emotional experience of that. People talked about true self, which we were talking about, right? That they felt with another person they could actually fully be who they are. That there's a sense of vulnerability. We see this in mammals, like all of us have probably seen video of lion cubs playing with each other when they're young and they roll over and they expose their bellies and their necks, all the vulnerable parts of who they are. This presence, being present with others and finding that to be enough, as one of our respondents said. And a sense of openness, that the play opens up a space for us to talk and to share, to be vulnerable. One mom said, when I play with my kids, I'm sending them the message that they're worth it, that they're valuable, that I could take time to just be with them and play, and that creates this beautiful sense of closeness. So I want to finish today by talking a little bit about a recent research study that we've been involved with called Neighbors Table. So I was invited to be part of this project by a couple of community organizations. They're faith-based organizations that come out of a Christian tradition, and they work with undocumented immigrants. And their desire is to create dialogue, to create a sense of person about immigration, about more specifically immigrants, with church congregants. How do we bring these two worlds together and help them understand and find each other in some particular way? And they'd tried a number of different means of doing this in different formats that weren't very successful. And they finally invited some members from a church into a home, an immigrant family's home. And that family had prepared a meal and they shared a meal together. And then as they shared the meal, they heard stories. Immigration stories, what it was like to get here, what it's like to be here in the Southwest of the United States. And that's when they brought me in to be part of this project. And so now we've been building on it and we've been collecting more data. And here's some of the things that we're learning about this time, right? That eating and storytelling does create a space for play and advocacy. As you'll see, that the meal sharing time, which happened at the beginning, created a space for laughter, a space for us to engage each other and become somewhat comfortable with each other, that set up some very beautiful, tearful moments later in our discussions. It created a space of vulnerability, of connection, and it gave immigrant family members a voice, an opportunity to speak up. But it also gave church congregants a voice as well. Here they were in a space where normally they don't have an opportunity to share or ask questions or to understand something more fully. So what did we find? Well, we found that all began with welcoming. right? That as we came, and I had a beautiful experience of showing up a little early and talking with one of the moms. There were we had 4 meals going on in a particular neighborhood at different houses. And the one that I got there first. She knew very little English. And I know the Spanish that I learned here at ASU as an undergrad, which was a few years ago. But it was a fabulous kind of time of play, of working through English and Spanish with one another. And I felt an unbelievable connection to her already before we'd even gone in to share the meal. Bienvenidos a nuestra casa. Welcome to our home. Pasen a la comida. Right? Move on to the food. This is what everyone was hearing as they came in. By the way, one of the beautiful places where we saw play take place as well was that for many of the parents that were sharing, one of their older children did a lot of translating for them. So in the translation process, as it moved back and forth, there was this playful dynamic that went through, and sometimes little inside jokes with them. And a few of us knew enough Spanish that we would smile because we knew what they were talking about. And there was a beautiful dynamic that developed. Then there was a playing in harmony. There was a synchrony that began to develop as the evening progressed. Because it was in a faith community, many of the dinners began with some type of prayer, sometimes people even holding hands with each other, individuals that didn't know each other from 2 separate countries holding hands, sharing, ready to hear stories, and then engaged in embodied listening. There was not a person in those spaces, right, that wasn't fully engaged and present in what was happening. So interestingly enough, the themes that we saw in our intimacy research, right, showed up here as well, right? As there was a sense of closeness and a sense of relative intimacy that was developing even in the first meeting that we had with each other. So on the left side here, we see the themes that I gave you before, but on the right side, you see how they were expressed during the neighbor's table meal. So there was a lot of laughter, as I've already described when we first started. Sometimes we had to find chairs and we had to make spaces. We were in small homes, tightly pressed in. It was a beautiful time and a wonderful time to be together. There was storytelling that went on, not always just from the immigrant families, but often, sometimes from kids, sometimes parents, sometimes the adult couples sharing with each other and helping each other in the storytelling process. And the eating together that was fabulous, salsas and enchiladas and questions about how something was made or beans or what's in something or other. It's a wonderful time of interaction that helped us to connect. An affectionate touch through holding hands, for prayer, for hugs. I think every group, as they finished their time together, hugged one another on the way out the door. And as I mentioned before, not really mock fighting. We weren't really in that space for this particular time. But the emotional experience of being able to see some of someone's true self. This was very beautiful as personal stories were told. One couple who had been waiting 20 years to get anything from the government to be here legally, right? They've been trying to work through the system, finally gotten the documentation they needed, so that now, after 20 years, they've always wanted to be married, but they couldn't because they didn't have the documentation. So one of their first acts now was to choose to join themselves legally. It was a beautiful, beautiful time with tears as people were vulnerable. A number of people told stories about being here, but being afraid to go back to Mexico because their kids are here, many of them involved with DACA. And at home, family members who are ill, family members who have passed away, but unable to go be with their family because they're afraid they can't get back into the country at this time. One woman spoke with tears about her fear in the last couple of years of things have changed politically, her fear of going to her child's school and volunteering and giving and being engaged with the parents for fear that someone would find out that she's here undocumented. This presence with the other, intense focus, times of quietness and silence and moments of just experiencing deep emotion with one another. An openness as we gently probed and asked questions and gave people permission not to respond if that was how they were most comfortable. worth and value, right? The hugs and verbal affirmation. But as the mom had said before in the intimacy study, it was true here too. The fact that we would spend 5 hours, it was a 5-hour process of being together, sharing a meal, being in someone's home, simply to hear their story, to understand more about their journey, and then the beautiful, beautiful closeness that came with that. I want to finish with a final quote from Olafson. Olafson says that it is a lack of imagination that allows indifference in the face of atrocities. It's my encouragement to you as you've heard these stories, you've heard some of our research and some of our thinking, and it's been my encouragement to myself, right, to engage my imagination, to engage it with others in a playful manner that allows me to take risks and openness and closeness with others, to create a space where something truly good can happen.